Tonight, we will tell you a story about something often overlooked, yet it was a silent, powerful force in the Middle Ages, shaping daily life, health, and even the very walls of castles. It is a story about waste and how its management, or more often, its lack of management, became a deadly hazard. You will learn why a seemingly simple necessity became a profound source of disease, how the architectural solutions of the time contained their own inherent flaws, and why even the air inside certain parts of a fortress could be a hidden killer. We will uncover the grim and dangerous profession of those tasked with dealing with the accumulating filth, and how entire towns wrestled with a problem that threatened to overwhelm them. This tale is a profound look at how basic sanitation shaped the course of history, and how its absence led to widespread suffering and death. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment suggesting future topics. New sleep stories are released every day. All right, find a comfortable spot, let your mind drift, and prepare to step back into a time when even the most private places held unexpected dangers. Our journey begins not in a grand hall, but in the most fundamental and universal aspect of human existence, the need to dispose of our waste, a need as old as humanity itself. The most fundamental needs of humanity, those that transcend time and culture, are often the least discussed. We speak of shelter, of food, of water, but rarely of what happens after these essentials are consumed. Yet, throughout history, the disposal of human waste has presented one of the most persistent and dangerous challenges to public health and urban development. From the earliest nomadic tribes to the bustling cities of the Middle Ages, every society grappled with this inescapable reality. In the absence of modern plumbing, the solutions were often rudimentary, driven by immediate necessity rather than long-term hygiene, and they would, in time, become silent architects of disease and death. Initially, for scattered groups or those living in sparse settlements, the solution was simple: the open ground. People would merely walk away from their dwelling into nearby woods or fields, allowing nature to absorb what was left behind. This worked tolerably well when populations were small and transient, when fresh ground was always available, and when human contact with waste was minimal. The sun and rain, combined with natural decomposition, served as the primary sanitation system. However, as human communities grew, as villages became towns, and as settled life replaced nomadic wandering, this method rapidly became inadequate. The areas immediately surrounding homes and common spaces would quickly become fouled, creating unpleasant odors that clung to the air and attracted swarms of flies and other vermin. This constant proximity of human waste to living areas naturally led to the earliest, most basic attempts at containment, driven by a simple desire for more localized cleanliness, even if the broader consequences were not yet fully understood. The next step in this evolution was the digging of simple pits. These were essentially holes in the ground, often located a short distance from dwellings, intended to collect waste in a more concentrated manner. Sometimes these pits were lined with stones or wood to prevent collapse, providing a slightly more structured approach, but often they were just raw excavations in the earth. This represented a slight improvement, as it kept the immediate living space cleaner, at least in theory, by centralizing the waste. Yet, these pits were still open to the elements, and to the air. Their putrid contents would eventually leach into the surrounding soil, inevitably contaminating nearby water sources like wells or springs, which were vital for drinking and cooking. The constant presence of flies and other insects, drawn by the decaying matter, served as relentless vectors for countless diseases, silently carrying pathogens from the waste directly to human food and skin. The smell, particularly in warmer months, would have been omnipresent, a thick, nauseating cloud hanging over settlements, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the unsanitary conditions. Even these basic improvements were merely delaying the inevitable consequences of poor waste management, creating concentrated pockets of filth that posed an ever-present threat. Within the confines of a home, especially during the night or in times of bad weather, venturing outside to a communal pit was often impractical or undesirable. This led to the widespread use of the chamber pot, a familiar object in homes across centuries and social strata. A chamber pot was, in essence, a portable receptacle, typically made of ceramic, metal, or wood, designed for urination and defecation indoors. It allowed individuals to relieve themselves without leaving the warmth or security of their bedchambers, offering a degree of privacy and convenience that was otherwise unattainable. While convenient for immediate use, the chamber pot merely postponed the problem of disposal. Each morning, or when full, its contents had to be emptied, and this daily ritual was fraught with its own set of dangers. The methods of emptying these chamber pots varied, but few were truly hygienic, and most contributed significantly to the overall public health crisis. In rural settings, the contents might be carried outside and deposited onto a dung heap, which could then be used as fertilizer for crops, or simply poured onto a garden patch or a designated area away from the house. In more densely populated areas, particularly within towns and cities, the disposal often became a public nuisance and a grave health hazard. It was common practice for chamber pots to be emptied directly into the street, often with a perfunctory warning cry like "Gardez-vous" in some European cities, an archaic warning to alert unsuspecting passers-by below of the descending refuse. This practice contributed immensely to the rivers of filth that ran through medieval streets, a viscous, foul-smelling mixture of human excrement, animal waste, discarded food scraps, and other refuse. The street, therefore, became an open sewer, a sprawling, unsanitary breeding ground for bacteria and disease. The accumulated waste would then either be washed away by rain into nearby rivers or streams, further polluting the vital water sources upon which entire communities relied, or it would simply dry and turn to dust, scattering pathogens on the ever-present wind, carrying them into homes and onto food. Even when communal cesspits were available in larger houses, castles, or monastic institutions, the act of emptying the chamber pot into these larger collection points still involved carrying the potentially infectious material through living spaces, often spilling or splashing along the way. The very act of transport could spread germs, and the pits themselves, often open or poorly covered, released noxious fumes and attracted even more pests, creating a perpetual cycle of contamination. The air in medieval settlements, therefore, carried not only the smoke from countless hearths, but also the pervasive stench of human and animal waste, a heavy, sickly, sweet aroma that permeated everything. This constant, unavoidable exposure to unsanitary conditions was not merely an inconvenience or a regrettable byproduct of daily life. It was a daily, silent killer, contributing directly to the high mortality rates and frequent, devastating outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and cholera that plagued the Middle Ages, silently decimating populations. The fundamental human need for waste disposal, met with such primitive and dangerous methods, created a perilous feedback loop where the very solutions bred new, deadlier problems, setting the stage for more structured, yet equally flawed systems within the emerging castles and fortifications. The stage was set for the development of dedicated, if still rudimentary, architectural features to manage this fundamental need, leading to structures that, while seemingly advanced for their time, would carry their own unique and often deadly hazards. As human settlements grew from scattered dwellings to more fortified and permanent structures, particularly during the early medieval period, the question of waste management within these confines became more complex. Simple outdoor pits and chamber pots, while functional in isolated settings, posed significant challenges in the dense, multi-storied environments of nascent towns and, most notably, castles. These imposing stone fortresses designed for defense and long sieges presented a unique architectural problem: how to dispose of human waste safely and conveniently for their inhabitants, often hundreds of people, without compromising the integrity of the fortifications or exposing the occupants to undue risk. It was from this specific need, driven by the demands of security and the limitations of medieval engineering, that a distinct architectural feature emerged, one that would become synonymous with castle life: the garderobe. The garderobe, a term you might recognize from its later association with clothing, was the medieval castle's answer to the toilet. It was not a detached outhouse, but an integrated part of the castle's very structure, usually built into the thick outer walls or within the strategic vantage points of turrets. Imagine, if you will, a small, narrow chamber, often no more than a few feet wide, recessed into the stone wall of a lord's private quarters, a guardroom, or even a communal hall. This chamber would typically contain a simple stone or wooden seat, sometimes just a plank with a hole in it, directly over an open shaft. This shaft, the defining characteristic of the garderobe, extended vertically downwards through the massive stone wall and opened directly to the outside of the castle. The design was deceptively simple, relying entirely on gravity. Waste would fall directly through the shaft, descending along the exterior of the castle wall, or sometimes into a moat, a river, or a dedicated cesspit at the base of the structure. From an engineering perspective, it was a practical solution for the time, requiring no complex plumbing or water systems. It provided a degree of privacy and convenience that was a step beyond the basic chamber pot, allowing inhabitants to relieve themselves without leaving the relative safety of the castle interior. The placement in turrets or projecting bays was often strategic, allowing the waste to fall clear of the main wall, theoretically preventing accumulation directly beneath the living areas. The interior of these small rooms was usually unadorned, just cold, rough-hewn stone, perhaps with a small, narrow slit window to provide a faint glimmer of light and a modicum of ventilation. The very simplicity of the design, however, carried inherent complexities and dangers that would only become apparent over centuries. The name itself, garderobe, offers a curious insight into medieval priorities and the multi-purpose nature of these spaces. The word is derived from the Old French garde-robe, meaning to guard robes, or a place for guarding robes. Originally, a garderobe was indeed a small room or closet, often adjacent to a bedchamber, where valuable clothing, furs, and other possessions were stored. The connection to a toilet function arose from a practical, if somewhat unappealing, medieval belief. It was thought that the strong, pungent odors emanating from the open waste shaft, particularly the ammonia from urine, would act as a natural deterrent to moths, fleas, and other pests that could damage precious fabrics. Thus, it became common practice to store clothing in these small, recessed chambers, directly above or very close to the waste chute. Over time, the primary function of these rooms evolved in common perception. While they may have continued to serve as rudimentary storage spaces, their most distinctive and frequently used feature became the waste disposal shaft, and the name garderobe gradually became synonymous with the latrine itself. This linguistic shift reflects a blending of practical necessity with an attempt at rudimentary pest control, showcasing the creative, if sometimes unsavory, adaptations of medieval life. The strategic placement of garderobes varied within a castle, depending on its size, layout, and the social hierarchy of its inhabitants. In larger castles, you might find several strategically located for convenience. The lord and lady would have their private garderobe connected directly to their bedchamber, offering the utmost privacy and ease. Knights and high-ranking officials might share access to one in a more communal area or adjacent to their sleeping quarters. For the common soldiers and servants, garderobes might be found in designated towers or along the curtain walls, serving a larger group. Each of these facilities, regardless of its location or the status of its users, shared the same fundamental design: a hole, a shaft, and a direct drop to the outside. This direct connection to the external environment, while seemingly efficient, was precisely where many of the system's most profound and dangerous flaws would manifest. The medieval mind, focused on immediate utility and defensive strength, had created a solution that solved one problem while inadvertently creating a host of others, problems that would linger literally and figuratively for centuries within the cold stone walls of their fortresses. So, while the garderobe offered a rudimentary solution to a universal human need, its design, for all its deceptive simplicity, was fraught with inherent flaws that created a host of new and often perilous problems. You see, the very simplicity that made it common also made it dangerously inefficient, transforming what was meant to be a convenience into a silent hazard. The most immediate and obvious flaw was the fundamentally open nature of the chute itself. There was no complex plumbing system, no water to flush away the waste, and certainly no sealed connection to a contained drainage network. Instead, human excrement simply dropped directly from the opening in the seat, through a hole in the thick castle wall, and then down into the open air, or into a designated collection area far below. This meant that the act of using the garderobe offered a remarkably direct and unmediated connection to the waste itself. There was no barrier, no seal, nothing to prevent what was deposited from being immediately exposed to the air, to the elements, and to anyone or anything unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity below. This open design also meant that splashback was an unpleasant and unavoidable reality for the user, a constant tactile reminder of the unhygienic nature of the system. Even the most fastidious lord or lady, or the most humble servant, would have found themselves in close and unavoidable proximity to the descending waste, a truly unsavory and unsettling experience that defied any sense of personal cleanliness. The air within the small, often cramped chamber, or privy as it was sometimes called, was perpetually heavy with the immediate presence of freshly deposited waste, a smell that would cling persistently to clothing and hair and permeate the very stone of the castle itself. This leads us directly to the second and perhaps most pervasive and inescapable problem, the overwhelming and inescapable stench. Imagine, if you will, the constant decomposition of human waste accumulating day after day, week after week, often for months or even years, with little to no effective ventilation beyond the open chute. The air in and around a garderobe was not merely foul. It was a potent, suffocating miasma, a truly unbearable atmosphere. These odors, a putrid and noxious blend of ammonia, methane, and various sulfur compounds, would rise directly back up the open chute, infiltrating the castle's interior. Often, garderobes were strategically placed in turrets or thick outer walls, sometimes even projecting outwards from the main structure. But even these architectural considerations did not entirely contain the terrible smell. The fetid air would seep relentlessly into adjacent rooms, through any cracks in the rough-hewn stone, under doors, and even into the private living quarters of the lord and his family, if the garderobe was located too close to their chambers, a constant affront to comfort and dignity. The very name garderobe, literally meaning to guard the robes, was said to derive from the belief that the strong ammonia fumes within the small chamber would deter fleas and other pests from clothing stored there. While this might have offered a minuscule and dubious benefit in pest control, it speaks volumes about the sheer, overwhelming intensity of the odor that it was considered potent enough to fumigate garments. It was a constant, low-level assault on the senses, a pervasive and inescapable reminder of the castle's ever-present waste problem that no amount of burning incense, fragrant herbs, or open windows could truly mask or dissipate. The very stones of the castle, absorbing these powerful corrosive odors over years and even centuries, would themselves begin to exude a faint, lingering smell, a ghostly echo of the waste that had passed through their ancient walls. Finally, there was the critical and deeply problematic issue of what happened to the waste once it exited the chute. In most cases, it simply fell to the base of the castle wall, either directly into the moat, an adjacent defensive ditch, or simply accumulated on the ground below. This created a visible, festering mound of human excrement exposed to the elements, to the sun, the rain, and to all manner of scavengers and creatures. If the garderobe emptied into a moat, the water would quickly become a stagnant, polluted cesspool, thick with waste, teeming with bacteria, and dark with decomposing matter. The moat, which was originally intended as a formidable defensive barrier, became instead a breeding ground for disease, its putrid waters a constant source of infection for anyone who came into contact with them, or even breathed the putrescent air above them. If the waste accumulated on dry ground, it would form a large malodorous pile, an unsightly and deeply unsanitary feature that attracted flies, rats, and other vermin in droves, all of which served as highly effective vectors for countless illnesses. Rain would periodically wash some of the waste away, spreading the contamination further across the landscape into nearby streams, rivers, or groundwater sources, thereby contaminating the vital drinking water for those living outside the castle walls or further downstream. Over time, these accumulations of night soil, as the collected waste was known, could grow quite substantial, representing a significant logistical and ongoing health challenge for the castle inhabitants. It was a visible and undeniable testament to the severe limitations of medieval engineering and sanitation practices, a constant reminder that for all the grandeur, defensive strength, and strategic importance of a medieval castle, the most basic human function presented an insurmountable and deeply unsanitary problem, spreading its silent dangers far beyond the immediate confines of the privy itself. This constant, uncontrolled discharge of raw waste created an environment where disease could flourish unchecked, where the very structural integrity of the castle walls was compromised by the corrosive nature of the waste and constant moisture, and where the air itself was a testament to the profound challenges of living in such close proximity to one's own effluents. The simple act of waste disposal, designed primarily for immediate convenience, inadvertently became a complex and dangerous ecological problem, polluting the immediate surroundings and setting the stage for the widespread transmission of unseen threats. The waste, once out of sight within the castle, was rarely out of mind for long, its lingering presence a constant low-level threat to the health and well-being of all within and around the castle walls. It was a system that, while seemingly practical for its time, inadvertently created a relentless cycle of contamination, where every single use contributed to a growing problem, both visible and invisible, threatening the very lives it was meant to accommodate. The sheer volume of waste generated by even a small castle population over weeks and months meant that these accumulations were not merely temporary inconveniences, but permanent, growing hazards. They served as a constant source of airborne pathogens, carried on the wind into the castle courtyards and beyond, settling on surfaces and contaminating food and water supplies. The very ground around the castle became saturated with centuries of waste, making it a perpetually unhealthy environment. This direct and unmitigated exposure to raw sewage was a fundamental design flaw, one that would have profound, deadly, and far-reaching consequences for the inhabitants of medieval castles and the surrounding communities, laying the groundwork for the rapid spread of epidemics and undermining the health of entire populations for generations. The casual approach to waste disposal, deeply rooted in the limited understanding of hygiene and disease transmission prevalent at the time, turned what should have been a simple convenience into a persistent, grave danger, a silent killer, lurking beneath the very foundations of power and authority. The seemingly innocuous chute, a symbol of early architectural ingenuity, was in truth a conduit for widespread illness and discomfort, a stark testament to the era's struggle with basic public health. The consequences of these inherent flaws were not abstract. They were felt in the daily lives of everyone, from the lowest servant to the highest Lord, a constant, unpleasant reminder of the unseen dangers that permeated their medieval world. The very design of these garderobes, while appearing convenient in their simple function, introduced a fatal vulnerability that silently, yet relentlessly, undermined the health and well-being of all who resided within the castle walls. We have explored the immediate issues of their open nature, the direct exposure to waste, and the inescapable foul odors. Now, we must consider the far more insidious consequence, the direct and devastating facilitation of disease and widespread contamination. Imagine the constant descent of human waste, day after day, week after week, into the depths below. Whether it fell into a deep cesspit at the base of the wall or directly into a moat or river, this waste was not merely an unpleasant byproduct. It was a teeming incubator for countless pathogens, an invisible enemy thriving in the very heart of the defensive structure. The open chutes, often little more than a hole in the wall, provided a direct, unobstructed conduit for these unseen dangers to travel in multiple directions. Consider the vectors of disease that flourished in such environments. Flies, drawn by the pervasive and sickening stench of decaying organic matter, swarmed around the accumulated waste. These tiny creatures, landing repeatedly on the facies, would then carry microscopic particles, bacteria, viruses, and parasites on their legs and bodies. From the waste pits, they would effortlessly fly back up into the living quarters of the castle, into the kitchens where food was prepared, into the dining halls where meals were consumed, and into the bed chambers where people slept. Each landing, each brush of a fly's foot was a potential act of contamination, silently introducing deadly agents into the very spaces where life was meant to be sustained. Rats and mice, similarly attracted to the refuse and the warmth of the castle structures, burrowed into the earth beneath the pits or scurried along the walls. They, too, were carriers, their fur and paws picking up pathogens, which they then deposited in larders, on floors, and near water sources. Their droppings, often indistinguishable from dust or dirt, were another source of contagion. These rodents also brought with them fleas, which, as history would later reveal with terrifying clarity, were themselves carriers of even more devastating diseases, though the full extent of this connection was unknown to the medieval mind. The contamination was not limited to airborne or vermin-borne transmission. Water sources were particularly vulnerable. If a garderobe emptied into a moat, and that moat was connected to a well or river that supplied drinking water, the cycle of contamination was complete and devastating. Even if the waste fell into a dedicated cesspit, seepage through the ground could pollute nearby wells, springs, or underground water tables. The very water that castle inhabitants used for drinking, cooking, and washing could be tainted with the very waste they sought to dispose of. This direct fecal oral transmission route was a primary driver of disease, far more potent than any medieval person could comprehend. Consequently, medieval castles, despite their formidable defenses against external foes, were often internally compromised by rampant illness. Dysentery, a severe intestinal infection causing bloody diarrhea, was endemic. It weakened garrisons, incapacitated knights, and claimed the lives of countless inhabitants, particularly children and the elderly. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated food and water, was another constant threat, manifesting as high fevers, weakness, and internal bleeding. Cholera, though less prevalent in early medieval times, would later become a devastating scourge, and its spread was inextricably linked to contaminated water supplies. General fevers and stomach ailments, often undiagnosed by modern standards, swept through populations with alarming regularity, frequently attributed to miasmas, bad air, rather than the true source, the unseen microbes thriving in the accumulated waste. The persistent foul odor, the miasma that people believed caused sickness, was indeed a sign of danger, but the true threat was microscopic. The lack of understanding about germ theory meant that medieval people could not grasp the direct link between their waste disposal systems and the outbreaks of illness that plagued their communities. They might air out rooms, burn herbs, or try to mask the smell, but these efforts did nothing to address the fundamental problem of pathogens circulating freely through their environment. They simply did not know that the very air they breathed, the water they drank, and the food they ate were constantly under threat from the unmanaged products of their own bodies. This constant exposure meant that castle inhabitants, from the lord and lady to the lowliest servants, lived in a perpetual state of vulnerability. A single infected person using a garderobe could unknowingly initiate a cascade of illness throughout the entire fortress. The close quarters of castle life, combined with the continuous presence of untreated human waste, created an ideal breeding ground for epidemics. The stone walls, designed to protect from siege, could not protect from the invisible enemy thriving within the very structures they enclosed. Every breath carried the microscopic possibility of sickness. Every meal, the risk of contamination. The seemingly simple convenience of the garderobe was, in fact, a silent, relentless killer, a constant reminder that even in the most secure strongholds, the greatest threats could arise from within, unseen and misunderstood. The sheer volume of waste generated by hundreds of people living in close proximity, all funneled through those basic, open systems, guaranteed a steady supply of pathogens. The very act of living in a medieval castle, therefore, was an act of constant biological hazard. The air, thick with the smell of waste, was also thick with the unseen agents of disease. This perpetual cycle of contamination meant that medieval life, especially within the confines of a castle, was often a struggle against illness, a struggle made all the more difficult by the complete absence of scientific understanding of how these illnesses truly spread. The garderobe, while solving one problem, inadvertently created a far more deadly one, turning the very air and water within the castle into a conduit for sickness, a constant threat to the lives of its inhabitants. The consequences were profound, manifesting not just as discomfort, but as widespread sickness and premature death, a silent epidemic woven into the very fabric of medieval daily life, a grim testament to the fact that even the most innovative solutions of their time could harbor hidden, deadly flaws. The issues with medieval sanitation extended far beyond the immediate concerns of smell and disease, subtly, yet profoundly, undermining the very fabric of the castles themselves. Imagine, if you will, the constant corrosive flow of human waste, day after day, year after year, through these open garderobe chutes. This was not merely a matter of simple disposal. It represented a relentless and insidious assault on the structural integrity of the magnificent stone walls that defined these fortresses. The waste, perpetually laden with moisture and a complex array of corrosive organic compounds, would inevitably seep, drip, and saturate the porous mortar and the individual stone blocks comprising the castle walls. Over the passage of time, this continuous dampness, coupled with the inherent acidic nature of urine and decomposing fecal matter, initiated a slow yet inexorable process of decay. The lime mortar, the essential binding agent that held the individual stones together to form a cohesive wall, was particularly vulnerable. It would gradually soften, lose its adhesive properties, and begin to crumble, transforming from a robust sealant into a friable, sandy residue. The stone itself, especially softer, more absorbent varieties such as limestone or sandstone, which were commonly employed in medieval construction due to their availability and ease of working, would become saturated. This saturation led to a weakening of the stone's internal structure, making it more susceptible to chemical erosion and, in regions with significant temperature fluctuations, to the destructive forces of freeze-thaw cycles. You would observe, over decades, the gradual appearance of telltale signs, dark, permanent stains spreading across the masonry, indicative of deep penetration, efflorescence, the white, powdery deposits of dissolved salts left behind as moisture evaporated, and, most critically, the spalling or flaking of the stone surface, where layers would peel away, exposing fresh, vulnerable material beneath. Ultimately, this led to a general degradation of the entire wall section surrounding the garderobe shafts, rendering these areas visibly weaker and structurally compromised. This progressive weakening was not a superficial problem that could be easily ignored or simply painted over. As the mortar eroded and the stone gradually crumbled, the fundamental load-bearing capacity of that specific section of the wall was severely and often irrevocably compromised. You would witness the development of significant cracks, sometimes hairline fissures that slowly widened over years. At other times, deep, jagged fractures that extended both vertically and horizontally from the immediate vicinity of the garderobe shaft, unmistakably indicating the immense stress placed upon the masonry. In the most severe and long-neglected instances, this relentless degradation could lead to sections of the wall visibly bulging outwards, a clear sign of internal structural failure, or even, over many centuries, to a partial collapse if the damage remained unaddressed and the section was subjected to additional stress, such as from the weight of the structure above or external pressures. Furthermore, the very foundations of the castle were not immune to this hidden assault. If the waste pits located directly beneath the garderobes were allowed to overflow, or if the liquid waste seeped deeply into the ground, it would saturate and chemically alter the underlying soil. This saturation led to a reduction in the soil's bearing capacity, its ability to firmly support the massive weight of the stone above. The result was often uneven settlement, where one part of the foundation would sink more than another, causing further stress, differential cracking, and a cascading effect of structural instability throughout the walls and towers resting upon those affected foundations. Thus, the grand, imposing stone fortresses, meticulously engineered and painstakingly constructed to withstand the most ferocious sieges and the relentless ravages of time, contained within their very core these hidden points of profound structural vulnerability, slowly but surely undermined by the very systems designed to provide a rudimentary level of comfort for their inhabitants. The inherent difficulty of addressing these issues was compounded by the fact that garderobe chutes were frequently integrated directly into the main defensive walls, often within the thickest and most critical sections, such as those of a keep or a major curtain wall. This strategic placement, while convenient for the users, meant that any structural damage near a garderobe was not merely an aesthetic flaw or an internal nuisance. It represented a potential and critical breach in the castle's defenses. A weakened section of wall, compromised by years of waste seepage, could become a prime target for undermining during a siege or simply lead to a catastrophic failure of the wall over an extended period of time due to natural forces. Beyond the visible structural decay, the persistent dampness originating from the garderobes also contributed significantly to an unhealthy and deeply uncomfortable environment throughout the interior of the castle. This dampness was not confined to the immediate vicinity of the latrines, but permeated adjacent rooms and even entire sections of the building. Mold and mildew thrived in these constantly moist conditions, not only discoloring stone and plaster, but also actively degrading internal wooden elements such as floorboards, ceiling beams, and wall paneling, leading to rot and a further weakening of internal structures. The air within the castle, even in parts seemingly distant from the direct source of the garderobe, could carry the pervasive musty smell of damp stone, persistent decay, and the faint yet unmistakable odor of waste, creating a constant unpleasant reminder of the unseen forces at work. The architects and master builders of these magnificent structures had, perhaps unwittingly, designed in a slow-acting poison that continually gnawed at their creations from within, a testament to the difficult and often unacknowledged balance between the immediate needs of daily life and the enduring strength critically required of a fortress. The maintenance of such a castle, therefore, involved not only the familiar tasks of repairing battle damage, patching deficiencies caused by weathering or replacing worn-out sections, but also a constant, exhausting, and often uphill battle against the corrosive effects of its own waste disposal systems. This silent, unseen battle against internal decay was a relentless burden borne by countless castle stewards, masons, and laborers throughout the medieval period. It required a continuous effort to patch crumbling mortar, repoint weakened stone joints, and reinforce walls that were always being subtly, yet profoundly, eroded from within. These were not quick fixes, but ongoing laborious processes that absorbed significant resources and manpower, representing a hidden cost of medieval living, a testament to the fact that even the most formidable structures were susceptible to the slow, relentless work of decay, stemming from a basic human need. The very convenience of the garderobe, allowing waste to drop directly from the living quarters, created a perpetual Achilles heel for these otherwise impregnable bastions. Their ingenuity in solving one problem inadvertently created another, more insidious one, slowly chipping away at their own foundations and stability. Beyond the slow, insidious decay that medieval waste systems inflicted upon the very stones of a castle, these crude arrangements also presented immediate and often deadly physical dangers to the people who lived within or around them. The open nature of the garderobe chutes, designed to funnel human waste directly downwards, created a constant, perilous void. Imagine, if you will, the dim light that permeated most medieval castles, even during the day, struggling to reach the depths of these narrow shafts. At night, in the flickering glow of a single candle or the profound, impenetrable darkness, a misstep could lead to an unspeakable horror. A child wandering too close, or a servant navigating the castle's labyrinthine passages in the dead of night, perhaps drowsy or distracted, might stumble. An elderly person, whose sight or balance was failing, could lean too far. The result was a plunge into the cesspit below, a dark, suffocating abyss filled with years, even decades, of accumulated human waste. The fall itself would be terrifying, a sudden drop into the unknown, likely accompanied by the splintering of old wood or the scraping of rough stone. But the true horror lay at the bottom. The depths of these pits were not just foul. They were a viscous, semi-liquid trap. A person falling in would not simply land, they would sink. The density of the waste, combined with the lack of solid footing, meant that escape was incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The sheer weight of the putrid matter could pin a person down, making movement a desperate losing struggle. The air in these confined spaces was thick with methane and other noxious gases, the byproduct of decomposition, which would quickly overwhelm the lungs, leading to asphyxiation. Even if one managed to avoid immediate drowning or suffocation, the raw, untreated sewage was a potent cocktail of pathogens. Open wounds, scrapes, or even simple exposure would lead to rapid infection, fever, and a slow, agonizing death from a myriad of diseases, far from any help or comfort. The thought of such an end, lost in the cold, dark, and utterly desolate depths of a castle's own filth, must have been a haunting specter for anyone living near these structures. It was a silent, ever-present threat, a hidden maw within the very fabric of the supposedly secure stronghold. The dangers, however, were not limited to accidental falls. These openings, though primarily for waste disposal, could also be exploited for more sinister purposes. During a siege, a well-placed garderobe chute could become a precarious weapon. While too narrow and often too foul for direct infiltration by an enemy, the opening at the bottom, facing outwards, could be used by defenders. Imagine a besieging army attempting to undermine a castle wall. From the narrow slit of a garderobe, defenders could drop rocks, boiling water, or even burning pitch onto the heads of those below, adding a grotesque layer of defense to the already formidable fortifications. The very waste that filled these chutes could also be, and likely was, employed as a deterrent. The unsanitary conditions, the stench, and the very real threat of disease would make any attempt to climb near or enter through such an opening a truly desperate act for an attacker. The psychological impact of being assaulted by a torrent of human excrement, even if not physically lethal, would certainly be demoralizing and unforgettable. It was a grim form of biological warfare, born out of necessity and the proximity of the waste system. Furthermore, the isolated and often hidden nature of these pits made them ideal for the disposal of bodies, a chilling testament to the darker side of medieval life. In the vast, sprawling castles, where secrets could be kept and power wielded without much oversight, a garderobe cesspit offered a convenient and effective way to make a body disappear. A murder victim, an inconvenient enemy, or even a prisoner who had died under mysterious circumstances could be quietly dropped into the depths. The act itself would be swift and silent, the splash muffled by the viscous contents. Once submerged, the body would be swallowed by the layers of waste, decomposition accelerated by the anaerobic environment, making discovery incredibly difficult. The stench emanating from the pit would mask any other odors, and the general revulsion associated with these areas would deter anyone from lingering or investigating too closely. Without forensic science or systematic record-keeping, a person simply vanished. Their final resting place, an unhallowed grave beneath the very walls of the castle where they may have once lived or served. These pits, therefore, became not just receptacles for waste, but silent, forgotten tombs holding grim secrets within their cold stone bellies. The presence of such potential death traps and disposal sites speaks volumes about the pragmatic, often brutal realities of medieval existence. Life was cheap, and the conveniences of the powerful often came with unseen, horrifying costs. The very structures designed for the private convenience of the lord or lady of the castle inadvertently created hidden chambers of horror, where accidents could turn fatal in the most gruesome ways, and where dark deeds could be concealed with chilling efficiency. These were not mere architectural features. They were active elements in the daily struggle for survival and power, embodying both the practical ingenuity and the stark, unvarnished dangers of the medieval world. The silent, dripping walls of the garderobe chutes whispered tales not just of waste, but of despair, danger, and forgotten lives, a stark contrast to the noble images of chivalry and grandeur that often define our perception of the Middle Ages. They were a constant, tangible reminder of the fragility of human life and the harsh realities of a world where sanitation was a luxury and death could be found in the most unexpected and revolting places. The very air around these structures, heavy with the scent of decay, carried with it the unspoken stories of those who met their end within their dark embrace, a chilling testament to the often overlooked dangers of medieval daily life. While the immediate hazards of medieval waste systems were clear and the constant threat of disease permeated the air around them, the sheer volume of accumulated human refuse presented an even more daunting challenge: its removal. These vast, putrid collections of waste, often gathered in deep cesspits beneath the garderobes of castles and manor houses, or simply piled in neglected corners of urban spaces, could not remain indefinitely. They festered, they grew, and their noxious presence became an unbearable burden on the senses and a profound risk to human health. They had to be emptied, and this task, a truly unenviable one, fell to a specific, often reviled group of individuals whose lives were defined by the very substances others sought to escape. These were the gong farmers, a name that held a certain grim poetry. The term gong itself is thought to derive from the Old English word gang, which could refer both to the act of going, perhaps to the place where waste was deposited, or to the refuse itself. They were also known by other equally descriptive titles, such as gong fevers, or more commonly, nightmen. The latter name was a direct and telling reference to the time when their grim work was primarily carried out. The decision to perform this labor under the cloak of darkness was not arbitrary. It was a practical, essential necessity, born of a desperate attempt to mitigate the unbearable public nuisance. Imagine, if you can, the thick, heavy air, even at the deepest hours of the night, clinging to everything, permeating clothing and skin, a constant, sickening presence that announced their arrival long before they were ever seen, a herald of unseen foul depths. The work itself was brutally physical, extraordinarily hazardous, and utterly thankless. Armed with little more than rudimentary shovels, often made of wood or crudely forged iron, and sturdy wooden buckets, perhaps with a simple flickering lantern to pierce the oppressive darkness, these men descended into the dark, enclosed spaces of the cesspits. Some pits were relatively shallow, allowing them to stand partially submerged in the viscous, putrid liquid and semi-solid waste, shoveling it into buckets passed up to colleagues above. Others were deep, narrow shafts, sometimes extending 20 or 30 feet down into the earth, requiring them to be lowered by rope into the suffocating depths. Here, they would work in absolute blackness, guided only by the faint, wavering glow of a lamp from above, or by the squelching, sucking feel of the thick, oozing sludge beneath their feet. The sheer physical exertion required to lift heavy, saturated waste in such conditions was immense, leading to exhaustion that further compounded the dangers. The dangers extended far beyond the immediate physical grime and the overwhelming, pervasive stench. The decomposition of organic matter within these sealed or semi-sealed pits produced a deadly cocktail of gases, invisible yet profoundly lethal. Methane, a highly flammable gas, was produced in abundance as bacteria broke down the waste, posing a very real and constant risk of explosion if an open flame, perhaps from a dropped lantern or a carelessly struck spark, were to ignite the concentrated fumes. More insidious, however, were the toxic gases. Hydrogen sulfide, often recognized by its faint, rotten egg smell in smaller, safer concentrations, but which quickly deadens the sense of smell at higher, more dangerous levels. In these concentrated environments, hydrogen sulfide could cause immediate respiratory distress, dizziness, loss of consciousness, and rapid death by attacking the nervous and respiratory systems. Another silent killer was carbon dioxide, also a byproduct of decomposition, which could displace oxygen in the confined spaces, leading to swift asphyxiation without warning. It was not uncommon for gong farmers to simply collapse and die in the pits, their bodies discovered only when their colleagues above ground realized the sudden, profound silence from below, a silence that signaled the final, fatal breath. The air in these pits was not merely foul, it was a silent, ever-present killer. Beyond the gases, the sheer volume of pathogens was a constant, invisible, and equally deadly threat. The human and animal waste contained every imaginable bacterium, virus, and parasite responsible for the most devastating diseases of the medieval era. A single cut or abrasion on the skin, an accidental splash in the eye, or the inhalation of airborne particles and aerosols from the disturbed waste could lead to severe and rapid infections, dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, and a host of other debilitating and often fatal illnesses. These men worked in a constant biohazard, their bodies perpetually exposed to the very sources of the widespread epidemics that frequently swept through medieval towns and cities, decimating populations. Their life expectancy was tragically short, their bodies often ravaged by chronic illness, persistent skin conditions, and the cumulative effects of constant exposure to toxic substances and raw sewage. Many would suffer from persistent coughs, respiratory issues, and digestive ailments that slowly but inexorably wore them down. The social standing of gong farmers reflected the inherently repellent and defiling nature of their occupation. They were almost universally ostracized, viewed with a potent mixture of revulsion, fear of contamination, and a grudging, unspoken necessity. No one wished to associate with them, not merely because of the lingering, inescapable odor that clung to them even after repeated washing, a smell that seemed to permeate their very skin and clothing, but because their work was considered fundamentally unclean, ritually defiling, and associated with disease and death. They lived on the fringes of society, often dwelling in isolated areas, their presence a constant reminder of the unpleasant realities of urban life. Yet, despite this profound social stigma and isolation, their services were utterly. While the isolated, often self-contained world of a castle presented its own particular challenges regarding waste management, the situation in the burgeoning medieval towns and cities was often far more dire, posing an even greater threat to public health and daily life. You see, a castle, for all its structural and sanitary flaws, was a relatively contained environment with a limited, manageable population. But as population swelled within city walls, and as trade and commerce drew more and more people into these confined spaces, the problem of human and animal waste escalated dramatically, becoming a visible, palpable, and inescapable crisis that defined much of the urban experience. Imagine, if you will, the sensory assault of walking through a bustling medieval street. Your eyes would likely be drawn to the vibrant chaos of the marketplace, the diverse attire of passers-by, or the intricate architecture of a guild hall. But your nose, perhaps even before your eyes, would immediately be assailed by a pervasive, sickening stench that clung to everything. This was the smell of accumulated refuse, a complex and ever-present miasma of decay. Unlike castles, which at least attempted dedicated, if flawed, garderobes, most urban homes lacked any form of internal plumbing or sophisticated waste disposal systems. For the vast majority of town dwellers, the simplest solution was also the most immediate and, tragically, the most dangerous. Waste, both human and animal, was simply thrown out into the street. From open windows, from doorways into narrow alleys, it was discarded with little thought for those below or the consequences that followed. Chamber pots, filled overnight, were emptied directly onto thoroughfares, often without warning to unsuspecting pedestrians, leading to the common, if crude, cry of "Gardez-loo!" a warning to look out for falling waste. Animal waste from the countless horses, pigs, and other livestock that constantly navigated the streets added to the putrid mixture, creating a thick, muddy paste of filth that covered the very ground upon which life unfolded. The very design of these towns, built for density and defense rather than sanitation, exacerbated the problem exponentially. Streets were often unpaved, or paved only crudely with uneven cobblestones, and typically sloped towards a central gutter or an open ditch. These gutters, nominally intended to carry away rainwater, became the de facto open sewers of the medieval city. They were never designed for constant flow or for the immense volume and variety of waste they received. Instead, they became stagnant, festering channels, choked with every conceivable form of filth. Human excrement, kitchen scraps, discarded food, industrial waste from tanneries or slaughterhouses, animal carcasses, and general household rubbish. During heavy rains, these gutters would inevitably overflow, transforming the streets into rivers of noxious, disease-laden sludge that flowed into homes, shops, and public spaces. The ground itself, beneath the thin veneer of daily activity, became saturated with centuries of accumulated waste, a constant pervasive source of contamination that seeped into the very foundations of buildings and the soil itself. This pervasive lack of sanitation had immediate, devastating, and far-reaching consequences for the health and well-being of the population. These open sewers, overflowing cesspits, and sprawling garbage heaps were not merely unpleasant. They were perfect, thriving breeding grounds for disease-carrying vermin. Rats, sleek and numerous, scurried through the refuse in an endless search for sustenance, carrying fleas that transmitted the terrifying bubonic plague, which could decimate a city's population in mere weeks. Flies, buzzing incessantly in thick clouds, landed on food in markets after crawling over human and animal waste, acting as vectors for dysentery, typhoid, and other debilitating gastrointestinal illnesses that led to widespread suffering and death. The very water sources upon which life depended were perpetually at risk. Wells, often dug within the densely packed city limits, could become easily contaminated by runoff from the saturated streets or by seepage from shallow, overflowing cesspits located perilously close by. Rivers, which many cities relied upon not only for drinking water, but also for washing, cooking, and bathing, simultaneously served as convenient dumping grounds for all manner of urban and industrial waste, creating a lethal paradox where the source of life became the source of death. The cycle of contamination was relentless, insidious, and for all practical purposes, inescapable. The daily reality for medieval town dwellers was one of constant, inescapable exposure to pathogens. Every breath drawn, every step taken, every meal consumed carried an inherent and significant risk of infection. Fevers, debilitating stomach ailments, gruesome skin diseases, and chronic respiratory infections were not exceptions. They were endemic, a common and accepted part of life. The concept of microscopic germs, the true agents of disease, was, of course, entirely unknown. People understood that filth was unpleasant, that bad smells could sicken, but they did not grasp the invisible, intricate connection between the foul odors, the visible waste, and the deadly diseases that swept through their communities with terrifying regularity. They attributed illness to bad air, or to divine punishment, or to unfavorable astrological alignments, never to the waste piled just outside their door or flowing down their street. This profound ignorance meant that even basic efforts to clean up were often futile, as they addressed only the visible symptoms, not the underlying, unseen root causes. A street might be swept, and some refuse carted away, but the underlying ground remained saturated, the wells still contaminated, the river still polluted. The sheer volume of waste generated by a dense urban population, combined with the complete lack of effective collection, treatment, and disposal infrastructure, meant that medieval towns were, in essence, vast open-air cesspools, constantly recycling their own contaminants. This constant state of unsanitary conditions was not merely an inconvenience or a matter of aesthetics. It was a fundamental, pervasive driver of mortality, shaping the very demographic landscape of the era and ensuring that outbreaks of disease were not rare occurrences, but a regular, terrifying, and often catastrophic fact of life. The problem of urban waste was a complex, systemic failure that contributed profoundly to the precariousness of medieval existence, making every day a quiet, unseen struggle against an invisible, omnipresent enemy, a constant reminder of the fragile line between life and death in a world yet to understand the very nature of disease. The scale of this challenge in the bustling, confined urban centers dwarfed even the significant issues faced within the walls of a castle, creating an environment where health was constantly compromised and life itself was often tragically short. These cities, beacons of trade and culture, were simultaneously incubators of pestilence, their very vibrancy contributing to their vulnerability, a silent threat embedded deeply within the fabric of their daily routine. The immense and ever-growing challenges posed by waste accumulation, particularly within the burgeoning towns and crowded cities of the medieval era, eventually forced authorities to acknowledge the urgent need for some form of regulation. While the scientific understanding of disease was still centuries away, the foul odors, visible filth, and undeniable spread of illness were impossible to ignore. It became clear that unchecked waste disposal was not merely an aesthetic problem. It was a public health catastrophe that threatened the very fabric of urban life and the productivity of its citizens. Thus, nascent attempts at waste management began to appear in various forms across medieval Europe. These were not comprehensive sanitation systems as we understand them today, but rather a series of fragmented, often reactive and largely localized efforts. One of the earliest and most common approaches was the implementation of ordinances. These were local laws or decrees issued by town councils, guilds, or even royal authorities, aiming to control the most egregious acts of public dumping. For instance, it became increasingly common to forbid citizens from throwing their household waste, offal from butchering, or human excrement directly into the streets or public waterways. Such prohibitions often came with the threat of fines, though enforcement was frequently inconsistent and difficult. Imagine the bustling streets of a medieval town, narrow, winding lanes, often unpaved, slick with mud and refuse. Before these ordinances, it was common practice for people to simply empty their chamber pots out of an upper-story window, or to toss food scraps and other rubbish directly onto the thoroughfare below. The new rules, however rudimentary, sought to curb this free-for-all. People were instructed to deposit their waste in specific designated areas, often at the outskirts of the town, or to collect it for later removal. In some larger cities, rudimentary public latrines were established, though these were often simple pits or open structures that quickly became overwhelmed and contributed their own share of stench and disease. Beyond direct prohibitions, there were also early attempts at communal cleaning. Town criers might announce days for public cleanup, or certain residents might be tasked with sweeping the streets in their immediate vicinity. This was a far cry from organized municipal waste collection, but it represented a recognition that collective action was necessary. Simple drainage systems also began to emerge in some areas, particularly in market squares or along main thoroughfares. These were typically shallow open gutters carved into the center or sides of streets, designed to carry away rainwater and, by extension, some of the lighter waste. However, these often became clogged with solid refuse, turning into stagnant, putrid channels that merely shifted the problem rather than solving it. The smell emanating from these open drains, especially on a warm day, would have been overwhelming, a constant reminder of the pervasive filth. Rivers and canals, which were vital for trade and transport, also served as convenient, albeit highly contaminated, dumping grounds. Authorities tried to regulate this too, understanding that polluted water sources could lead to sickness. Fines were levied against those who dumped large quantities of waste directly into the river, especially if it was near an intake point for drinking water, though the connection between water quality and health was still poorly understood. They recognized the immediate unpleasantness and the impact on fishing or navigation, but not the microscopic dangers lurking within. These early regulatory attempts, while well-intentioned, faced immense obstacles. The sheer volume of waste generated by a growing population, coupled with a complete lack of scientific knowledge about hygiene and disease transmission, meant that these efforts were largely reactive and palliative rather than truly preventative. There was no understanding of bacteria or viruses, no concept of sanitization beyond simply removing visible filth. The medieval mindset often attributed illness to divine wrath, bad air, miasma, or an imbalance of humors, not to the direct consequence of human waste. Furthermore, the limited resources of medieval towns and the difficulty of enforcing rules across a largely illiterate and often resistant populace meant that compliance was often poor. People had deeply ingrained habits of convenience, and changing them proved to be a formidable task. Even when regulations were put in place, the infrastructure to support them was almost non-existent. There were no dedicated sanitation departments, no regular waste collection services, and no effective means of treating or safely disposing of the waste once it was collected. The Gong farmers we discussed earlier represented the most advanced form of waste removal, but their services were expensive, and their methods still involved simply moving the problem to a new location, often just outside the city walls, where it would continue to fester. The story of medieval waste management is therefore a testament to a slow, painful progress. It shows a society grappling with a fundamental problem without the necessary tools or knowledge. The regulations that did emerge were born out of necessity, a desperate attempt to mitigate an overwhelming public nuisance and to prevent the most obvious forms of contamination. They laid the very earliest, fragile groundwork for future public health initiatives, even if their immediate impact was often limited. These attempts, however imperfect, marked a shift from complete indifference to a hesitant recognition that the collective well-being of a community depended in part on how it dealt with its waste. The next step, however, would take centuries of observation, experimentation, and a revolution in scientific understanding. The medieval period, which we have explored tonight, was a time of immense challenge when it came to the most basic human needs, particularly the disposal of waste. The solutions, as you have learned, were often crude, dangerous, and a ceaseless source of illness. Yet, out of these very difficulties, a slow, often painful, evolution began. The legacy of these medieval struggles is profound, shaping not only how we manage our waste today, but also how our cities are designed and how we understand public health. Initially, improvements were incremental, driven more by necessity and the sheer unpleasantness of the existing systems than by scientific understanding. Castle designers, recognizing the issues with open chutes, began to experiment with deeper cesspits, sometimes lined with stone or brick to prevent seepage into the foundations. They also sought to enclose the garderobe chutes more effectively, perhaps by extending them further from the wall or by adding a bend, though this often merely shifted the problem of accumulation. In more advanced designs, a simple form of flushing might be achieved by directing rainwater down the chute, a rudimentary attempt to wash away some of the accumulated filth, but this was rare and largely ineffective against the sheer volume of waste. As populations grew and towns expanded beyond the castle walls, the problem of waste management became a collective, rather than an individual, concern. The concept of a common good, albeit rudimentary, began to influence urban planning. Public latrines, simple pits with multiple seats, sometimes covered by a basic structure, started to appear in larger towns, though their maintenance was often neglected, and they quickly became breeding grounds for disease. Some towns attempted to create basic drainage channels, often open gutters running down the center of streets, to carry away surface water and, incidentally, some of the lighter waste. But these were far from effective sewers, frequently clogged, and contributed to the foul odors and contamination that defined medieval urban life. The true breakthrough in sanitation, the invention of the water closet, and the development of comprehensive underground sewage systems would not come for many centuries. The fundamental limitation was the lack of understanding of germ theory and the mechanics of water pressure and sealed pipes. Without this knowledge, progress was limited to containment and manual removal. The medieval period, therefore, represents a long, arduous lesson in the consequences of inadequate sanitation. However, the relentless exposure to disease and the constant struggle with waste subtly influenced societal attitudes. While medieval people lacked the scientific vocabulary, they intuitively understood that certain areas were healthier than others, that clean water was vital, and that waste, in some inexplicable way, contributed to sickness. This nascent awareness laid the groundwork for future public health movements. The very density of medieval towns, with their cramped dwellings and shared water sources, made the dangers of poor sanitation acutely clear. Plagues and epidemics, though often attributed to divine wrath or astrological alignments, slowly forced authorities to consider practical measures, however limited. The gradual shift from individual pits to more communal, albeit still primitive systems, also reflected a changing urban landscape. The need to manage waste on a larger scale prompted early forms of municipal organization. Town councils began issuing ordinances, for instance, forbidding the dumping of refuse directly into rivers or on main thoroughfares, or requiring householders to clear the area in front of their homes. These were early tentative steps towards what we now recognize as urban infrastructure and public health regulations. The concept of a common nuisance emerged, giving authorities some power to address particularly egregious sources of filth. The legacy of medieval sanitation is therefore a complex one. It highlights humanity's persistent struggle with its own biological processes and the environment. It demonstrates how long it took to connect abstract notions of dirt with tangible impacts on health. But it also shows the first hesitant steps towards a solution. The enclosed garderobe, despite its flaws, was a conceptual precursor to the modern toilet, moving the act of excretion from the open air into a more private, contained space. The cesspit, for all its dangers, was an early form of waste containment, anticipating later septic tanks. The lessons learned, often through immense suffering and loss of life, eventually led to the sanitary revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. The very problems that defined medieval life, the pervasive stench, the ever-present threat of disease, the constant battle against filth, created the impetus for engineers, reformers, and public health advocates to seek radical new solutions. Without the experience of medieval living, the urgency for change might not have been so keenly felt. So, as you drift into sleep, consider the long journey of humanity in simply keeping itself clean. From the perilous garderobes and the malodorous streets of the Middle Ages to the complex, unseen networks beneath our modern cities, a silent battle has been fought, one that continues to shape our world in ways we rarely consider. It is a story of slow, persistent progress, driven by necessity, fear, and eventually a growing understanding of how inextricably linked our health is to the unseen world of waste. And with that thought, may your rest be deep and undisturbed.